January 15th, 1974. A family in Wichita, Kansas wakes up to what they think is just another Tuesday morning. Joseph Otero kisses his wife Julie goodbye and loads 3 of their 5 kids into the car for school. It's cold outside, typical Kansas winter, the kind of morning where you just want to get through your routine and get on with your day. Charlie, Danny, and Carman pile into the back seat. Their 2 youngest siblings, Joey and Josephine, stay home. Just another Tuesday. Except it isn't. By 10 a.m., 4 members of the Otero family will be dead. Joseph Otero, 38 years old, strangled with a cord, a plastic bag over his head. Julie Otero, his wife, 34, strangled the same way, forced to watch her husband die first. Joseph Jr., their 9-year-old son, strangled while his mother's body was still warm. Josephine, their 11-year-old daughter, taken to the basement, hanged from a pipe, her body posed. The killer doesn't just murder them, he orchestrates it, controls every detail, takes his time, enjoys it, and when he's done, he walks out the door, gets in his car, and goes about his day like nothing happened. No panic, no remorse. Just nothing. 3 months later, the Wichita Eagle receives a letter. Inside the envelope is a detailed description of the Otero murders, written by the killer himself, information only he could know, details the police never released. He criticizes the investigation, points out what they missed, and at the bottom of the page, he gives himself a name, BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill. This is part 1 of the BTK story, the rise of a killer who hid in plain sight. A man who taught Sunday school and strangled women, who coached Little League and photographed corpses, who lived 2 lives so completely separate that nobody, not his wife, not his children, not his neighbors, not his church, had any idea what he really was. For 17 years, Dennis Rader will terrorize Wichita, Kansas. He'll kill 10 people, send taunting letters, demand recognition, and then, in 1991, he'll simply stop. This is the story of how a monster became your neighbor. Intent doesn't lie. People do. I'm Carman Carrion, and this is Deadly Intent, the show where we don't just tell you what happened, we dig into why it happened. The psychology behind the crime, the intent that drives someone to do the unthinkable. If you know me from Freaky Folklore or Destination Terror, you know I'm drawn to the dark corners of human nature, the stories that make us uncomfortable, the cases that force us to ask questions we don't really want the answers to. And the BTK case, it's one of the most disturbing examples of duality I've ever covered. Dennis Rader wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. He was the guy measuring your lawn, the guy teaching Sunday school, the guy handing out hot dogs at the neighborhood cookout. He was so ordinary, so unremarkable, that nobody could have imagined what he was really doing. Over the next 2 episodes, we're going to walk through the entire BTK story. Today we're covering 1974 to 1991, the killings, the letters, the double life, and the long silence. Next week we'll cover his return in 2004, and the investigation that finally brought him down. So let's start at the beginning. Let me take you back to January 15th, 1974, Wichita, Kansas, a city of about 250,000 people in the heart of the Midwest. Safe, quiet, conservative, the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where kids rode their bikes until dark and everyone knew their neighbors. It was the kind of city where something like the Otero murders just didn't happen. The Otero family had moved to Wichita just a few months earlier from Puerto Rico. Joseph Otero was an Air Force veteran who'd served in Vietnam. He had recently retired and was starting fresh. New city, new job, new life for his family. His wife, Julie, was a homemaker, devoted to taking care of their 5 children: Charlie, Danny, Carman, Joseph Jr., and Josephine. They were the kind of family everyone liked, friendly, involved. The kids were doing well in school. Joseph Sr. had just started a job at Coleman, the camping equipment company. Everything was looking up. That morning, January 15th, started like any other. Joseph Sr. got the 3 oldest kids ready for school. Charlie was 15, Danny was 14, Carman was 13. The 2 youngest, 9-year-old Joey, Joseph Jr., and 11-year-old Josephine, stayed home. Joseph Sr. drove the older kids to school, came back home, and that's when he realized Charlie had forgotten his school supplies, so he got back in the car and drove to the school to drop them off. When he came back home the second time, Dennis Rader was waiting inside. Now here's what you need to understand about Dennis Rader at this point in his life. He was 28 years old, married to Paula Dietz, who was pregnant with their first child. He worked for ADT Security, a company that installed alarm systems in people's homes. Think about that for a second. His job was literally going into people's houses, learning the layout, understanding their vulnerabilities, all under the guise of keeping them safe. And Rader had been using that access to hunt. He had been driving around Wichita for months, looking for targets. He had what he called his projects. Women he'd seen and start fantasizing about. He'd follow them, learn their routines, break into their houses when they weren't home just to see what it was like inside, touch their things, go through their drawers, take underwear as trophies. He had tried to act on these fantasies before, broken into homes, waited for hours, but something would always go wrong. Someone would come home early, or he'd lose his nerve, or the moment would pass. But with the Oteros, everything lined up perfectly. Rader had been watching the house. He knew Joseph Sr. left for work every morning, knew the kids went to school, knew Julie would be home alone with the 2 youngest children. He cut the phone line the night before, a trick he had learned from his job at ADT. He packed his hit kit, a bag filled with cords, tape, plastic bags, and knives. Everything he needed to fulfill the fantasy had been building in his head for months. That morning, when Joseph Sr. walked back into the house after dropping off Charlie's school supplies, Dennis Rader was standing in the hallway with a gun. Now, Rader wasn't a good liar. He wasn't particularly convincing. But when you're standing in someone's house with a gun pointed at their family, you don't have to be. He told Joseph Sr. that he was a wanted man on the run, that he just needed their car and some money, and then he'd be gone. Nobody would get hurt. Just cooperate and everything would be fine. Joseph Sr. had no choice but to believe him, or at least pretend to. He called Julie and the 2 youngest children into the bedroom. Joey and Josephine came in, confused and frightened. Rader ordered everyone to lie face down on the floor, and then he started tying them up. Here's where you start to see the real Dennis Rader, because this wasn't about robbery. This wasn't about escape. This was about control. This was about power. This was about fulfilling a sexual fantasy he'd been nurturing for years. He tied Joseph Sr.'s hands behind his back with cord, put a plastic bag over his head, wrapped another cord around his neck, and while Julie and the kids watched in horror, he strangled Joseph Otero to death. It took several minutes. Joseph fought, thrashed, tried desperately to breathe, and Rader just watched, waited, let it happen. Julie started screaming, begging, pleading for her children's lives. Rader told her to shut up, told her the kids would be fine if she just cooperated. Another lie. He killed her next. Same method. Plastic bag over her head, cord around her neck, slow, deliberate strangulation, while she fought and struggled and tried to live. 9-year-old Joey had just watched both his parents murdered in front of him. He knew what was coming, and Rader killed him too. A child, 9 years old. He took Joey to another bedroom and strangled him. That left Josephine, alone with a man who had just murdered her father, her mother, and her little brother. Rader took her down to the basement, stood her on a chair, put a noose around her neck, and tied it to a pipe. Then he kicked the chair out from under her. But he wasn't done yet, because for Dennis Rader, this was never about killing. It was about sexual gratification. So while Josephine's body hung from that pipe, he masturbated. When he was finished, he took a few items from the house, small things, trophies to remember this moment, and he left. Just walked out the door like he'd just finished installing a security system, got in his car, drove home to his pregnant wife, went about his day. At 3:40 that afternoon, Danny and Carmen Otero came home from school. They were 14 and 13 years old. They tried to get in through the back door, but they couldn't open it. They also noticed that their dog that was always in the house was in the backyard. So Danny went around to the front while Carmen finally got the back door open. They walked through the house and found chaos. Their father's wallet was on the stove, the kitchen a mess, and when they went into their parents' bedroom, they found their father on the floor and their mother on the bed, both bound, both dead. The children desperately tried to cut the ropes and perform CPR, not understanding yet that their parents were gone. Charlie arrived home from school shortly after. He was 15 years old. He took in the scene, the horror of finding both parents murdered, and ran to a neighbor's house to call for help. When the first officers arrived at the scene, they thought they were looking at a double homicide. But as they searched the house, Lieutenant Jack Watkins found Joey's body in another upstairs bedroom. And then, in the basement utility room, they found Josephine hanging from a sewer pipe. 4 members of the Otero family, murdered in their own home, on what should have been just another Tuesday morning. The 3 surviving children, Charlie, Danny, and Carmen, would learn that their younger siblings were also dead, that the 2 youngest, the ones who'd stayed home that day, had been murdered along with their parents. When the first officers arrived at the scene, they thought they were looking at a murder-suicide. They thought maybe Joseph Sr. had snapped, killed his family, and then killed himself. It was the only explanation that made sense in a city like Wichita. But the evidence didn't match. The bindings were too elaborate. The staging was too deliberate. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a family annihilation. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, someone who had planned this, someone who enjoyed it. The Wichita Police Department assembled a task force. They interviewed neighbors, canvassed the area, processed the crime scene for days. They found semen. They found fingerprints. They found fibers. But they had no suspect, no witnesses, no motive, nothing that pointed to anyone specific. And Dennis Rader? He went back to work at ADT, went to church on Sunday, had dinner with his wife, told her about his day like nothing had happened. Because to him, nothing had. He had just fulfilled a fantasy, checked something off his list, and now he was ready for the next one. But first, he wanted credit. For 3 months, Wichita tried to move on. The Otero murders were front-page news for weeks. People were terrified, installed new locks, bought guns, started looking at their neighbors differently. But with no suspect and no new leads, the case started to go cold. The media moved on to other stories. The task force kept working, but quietly. Life in Wichita slowly returned to normal, and Dennis Rader was furious. Because here's the thing about psychopaths like Rader. The act itself is only part of the satisfaction. The other part, the part that really feeds the ego, is the recognition, the attention, the knowledge that people know what you did and can't stop you. And nobody was talking about him anymore. The investigation was stalled, the media had moved on, and Rader felt like he had pulled off the crime of the century and nobody even cared. So in October 1974, he decided to remind them. Someone returned a book to the Wichita Public Library, a mechanical engineering textbook, nothing unusual. But when a reporter at the Wichita Eagle opened that book a few days later, a letter fell out. Handwritten, several pages long, detailed, disturbing. The letter described the Otero murders in graphic detail, information only the killer could have known. He described how he'd strangled Joseph Sr., how Julie had pleaded for her children's lives, how he had posed Josephine's body in the basement. He included details that the police had deliberately withheld from the public to filter out false confessions. He criticized the police investigation, pointed out evidence they had missed, told them they'd gotten things wrong in the newspaper reports. He corrected the record, not because he felt guilty, but because he wanted credit for his work. And at the bottom of the letter, he gave himself a name. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK. The police went into crisis mode. They had just learned that the Otero killer was still out there, still in Wichita, and actively seeking attention. This wasn't someone who had killed in a moment of rage and then fled the state. This was someone who lived here, walked among them, and wanted them to know it. They reactivated the task force, increased patrols, started analyzing the letter for clues, handwriting, paper type, word choice, anything that might identify the author. But Rader had been careful. The letter was handwritten on plain paper. No fingerprints, no DNA technology existed yet. The handwriting was distinctive but not immediately identifiable, and the content, while detailed, didn't reveal anything personal about the writer. It could have been anyone. The letter was released to the public and panic set in all over again. Wichita was no longer dealing with a single horrific crime. They were dealing with an active serial killer who was taunting them. And in Dennis Rader's mind, he had just won the first round of a game that would last for decades. But writing about his crimes wasn't enough. The satisfaction was already fading. The fantasy needed to be fed again. Less than 3 months after the Otero murders, on April 4th, 1974, Rader struck again. This time his target was Catherine Bright, 21 years old. She worked as a secretary and lived in a small house on East 13th Street in Wichita. Her brother Kevin, 19 years old, had stayed over the night before because of snow. That afternoon, around 12:30 p.m., Catherine and Kevin came home. They had no idea Dennis Rader was already inside, waiting. When they entered the house, Rader came out of the bedroom with a gun. Same story as before. He was a wanted man on the run from California, trying to get to New York. Just needed money and a car. Nobody would get hurt if they cooperated. Catherine and Kevin had heard about the Otero murders. Everyone in Wichita had. But Rader didn't match the profile they had imagined. He was clean-cut, calm, described himself as being in trouble. Just a guy who needed help. Rader ordered them into a bathroom. He forced Kevin to tie Catherine's hands behind her back. Then Rader tied Kevin up. But Kevin wasn't going to be a compliant victim. He fought, struggled against the bindings, and when Rader believed Kevin was trying to grab his finger, maybe to break it, maybe to get leverage, Rader panicked and pulled the trigger. He shot Kevin in the head, and then he shot him again. 2 gunshot wounds to the head, one to the right upper lip, one to the right forehead, powder burns visible around both wounds. But Kevin Bright didn't go down, didn't lose consciousness. Despite being shot twice in the head, he kept fighting. He broke free, struggled with Rader, and in the chaos, Kevin managed to escape the house and stumble into a neighbor's yard, bleeding and crying for help. Meanwhile, back inside, Catherine was trying to survive. She fought, screamed, tried desperately to get away, but Rader caught her. And this time, he didn't have time for his elaborate rituals. This time everything was going wrong, so he grabbed a knife and started stabbing. Catherine fought back with everything she had. She scratched him, bit him, drew blood, refused to die quietly. But Rader was stronger and enraged, because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were supposed to be afraid, compliant, controllable. He stabbed her 11 times, in her abdomen, her chest, her back, again and again until she finally stopped moving. But he wasn't done yet. Even as Catherine lay dying, even as Kevin had escaped and help was coming, Rader took the time to strangle her, a cord around her neck, because the stabbing wasn't enough. It had to be his way. Then he fled, ran out the back door, got in his car, and drove away. Because for the first time, things hadn't gone according to plan. For the first time, there was a witness who'd seen his face, who could describe him, who could identify him. Rader was terrified that this was it. This was how he'd get caught. Catherine Bright was rushed to Wesley Medical Center. She was taken into surgery, but her injuries were too severe. The stab wounds, the strangulation, the fight for her life had taken everything she had left. She died in surgery, 21 years old. Kevin survived, despite being shot twice in the head at close range. 19-year-old Kevin Bright lived to tell police what happened. He gave them a description. White male, about 25 years old, 5'11", 180 pounds, stocky build, light complexion, mustache, wearing a black stocking cap, windbreaker, army coat, silver wristwatch with an expansion band, black .22 automatic, wearing gloves and sweating profusely. The police put out a sketch based on Kevin's description, and it looked like half the men in Wichita. Nobody recognized him. Nobody called in tips that led anywhere. And once again, Dennis Rader walked away. But this time, he had learned something important. He needed to be more careful, more methodical. No more mistakes. No more witnesses. No more surprises. Next time, he'd make sure everything went exactly according to plan. Let's talk about what Dennis Rader's intent really was. Because if you look at the Otero murders and the Catherine Bright murder side by side, you see something critical. Dennis Rader wasn't trying to kill people. He was trying to play God. The Otero family murders were, in Rader's mind, perfect. He had planned for months, stalked the house, cut the phone lines, packed his hit kit with everything he needed. And when he walked into that house on January 15, 1974, he had total control. 4 people, a bedroom, cords and plastic bags, and hours to do whatever he wanted. Think about the choices he made. He didn't shoot them. He didn't stab them. He didn't make it quick. He strangled them, one by one, slowly, while the others watched and waited for their turn. That's not murder. That's orchestration. That's a man conducting a symphony of terror where he controls every note, every pause, every crescendo. Joseph Sr. died first, but not before watching his wife and children tied up and helpless. Julie died next, forced to watch her husband's murder, knowing her children were next, begging for their lives. 9-year-old Joey died watching both his parents' bodies cooling on the floor, and 11-year-old Josephine was taken to the basement, stood on a chair, hanged from a pipe, and posed. Every single detail was intentional. Every moment was controlled. And for Dennis Rader, that control was the entire point. This is what separates BTK from other killers. He wasn't angry. He wasn't responding to rejection or humiliation. He wasn't lashing out. He was fulfilling a fantasy he had been building in his head for years. A fantasy where he had absolutely power over life and death, where people existed only to play the roles he assigned them, where he was God and they were his playthings. The sexual gratification wasn't about sex. It was about power, about watching people realize they were going to die, and knowing he was the one who decided when and how, about being the most important person in the room, in the world, in those final moments of someone else's life. And when it was over, when 4 people lay dead in that house, Dennis Rader walked out the door and went back to his pregnant wife like he had just finished installing a security system, because in his mind, he had done exactly what he set out to do. He had played God. He had executed his fantasy perfectly. And that should have been enough. But then came Catherine Bright, and everything went wrong. Here's what you need to understand about the difference between the Otero murders and the Catherine Bright murder. The Oteros gave Rader what he craved: control, compliance, the ability to execute his fantasy exactly as he imagined it. Catherine Bright and Kevin Bright shattered that illusion. In Rader's mind, he was still the director of his own personal horror film. He had broken in. He had waited. He had the gun. He had the story about being on the run. He had his victims exactly where he wanted them. But Kevin Bright didn't follow the script. He fought back. He refused to die. And suddenly, Dennis Rader, the meticulous planner, the ADT security expert who studied people's vulnerabilities for a living, was in a situation he couldn't control. So he panicked. He shot Kevin once, twice, 2 bullets to the head at close range, and Kevin still didn't go down. This is the moment that terrified Dennis Rader, not because he felt remorse. Dennis Rader was incapable of genuine remorse, but because the first time, reality did match the fantasy. For the first time, he wasn't in control. And when Catherine fought, when she screamed and scratched and bit and refused to just die quietly, Rader's carefully constructed fantasy world collapsed completely. That's when you see the real Dennis Rader, not the calm, methodical killer of his imagination, but a panicked, enraged man stabbing a woman 11 times because she wouldn't stop fighting, because she wouldn't play her part, because she wouldn't let him be in control. He stabbed her in the abdomen, the chest, the back, again and again, until she finally stopped moving. But even that wasn't enough. Even as Catherine lay dying, even as Kevin had escaped and help was coming, Rader took the time to put a cord around her neck and strangle her, because the stabbing wasn't his fantasy. Stabbing was panic. Stabbing was loss of control. But strangulation? Strangulation was his signature, his method, his way of reasserting control even as everything fell apart. This is what separates someone like BTK from a crime of passion or even from other types of serial killers. The murder itself wasn't the point. The control was the point. The power was the point. The fantasy was the point. And when the fantasy broke, when reality intruded, he didn't feel guilt or horror at what he had done. He felt frustration, anger, fear of getting caught, yes, but not because he understood the enormity of taking a human life, because getting caught would mean losing his other life, his normal life, the life where he got to walk around pretending to be human. The Catherine Bright murder taught Dennis Rader two critical lessons. First, he needed to be more careful, more methodical. He needed to choose victims who couldn't fight back, lone women, smaller targets, situations where he could guarantee compliance. No more witnesses, no more surprises, no more variables he couldn't control. Second, the gap between fantasy and reality was dangerous, and he needed to close that gap, plan more carefully, stalk more thoroughly, eliminate every possible thing that could go wrong. Because for Dennis Rader, intent was everything, and his intent was never just to kill. His intent was to be God, to have absolute power over another human being, to make reality conform to his fantasy no matter what it took, no matter who had to die to give it to him. The Otero murder showed him what perfection felt like. The Catherine Bright murder showed him what happened when perfection slipped away. And for the next 3 years, he'd work on getting it back. Intent doesn't lie. People do. And Dennis Rader's intent was crystal clear from the very beginning. Total control, at any cost. After the Catherine Bright murder, Dennis Rader went quiet for a while. Not because he felt guilty. Guilt wasn't something Dennis Rader was capable of feeling. But because he was being cautious, lying low, waiting for the heat to die down. And during that time, his life looked completely, utterly normal. In 1975, his wife Paula gave birth to their first child, a son. Rader was a present father, involved. He changed diapers, did fillings, took his son to the park. In 1978, they had a daughter, and once again Rader stepped into the role perfectly. He coached her softball team, helped with homework, attended school events. To anyone watching, Dennis Rader was just a regular dad. Maybe a little uptight, maybe a little obsessed with rules and routines, but nothing alarming. He insisted on things being done a certain way. Dinner at the same time every night. The house kept spotless. Everything in its proper place. Paula thought he was just particular. Controlling maybe, but lots of husbands were like that. In 1974, Rader had started working for ADT Security Services, and he was good at his job. He installed alarm systems, assessed home security, gave people advice on how to keep themselves safe. The irony was lost on exactly no one except the people who hired him. But in 1979, Rader got a new job that suited him even better. Compliance officer for Park City, a small suburb just north of Wichita. As a compliance officer, Rader's job was to enforce city ordinances, making sure people mowed their lawns, kept their properties up to code, didn't park in the wrong places, didn't leave trash cans out too long. And Dennis Rader loved it. He loved the authority, the power, the ability to knock on someone's door with a citation and watch them scramble to comply. His neighbors hated him. His co-workers thought he was insufferable. There are stories of Rader measuring people's grass with a ruler, citing them if it was even a quarter inch over the city limit. He had photographed violations, document everything, follow up relentlessly. One woman later recalled that Rader had her dog impounded because it was running at large, even though the dog was in her own fenced yard. Another neighbor said Rader would drive by their house multiple times a day, looking for something, anything to cite them for. People thought he was petty, vindictive, a bureaucrat drunk on the tiny bit of power he had been given. But nobody thought he was dangerous. And meanwhile, Dennis Rader was also volunteering. He was a Cub Scout leader for his son's troop, president of the church council at Christ Lutheran Church. He taught Sunday school, helped organize community events, handed out hot dogs at church cookouts. Everyone who knew Dennis Rader had the same impression: boring, uptight, a stickler for rules, but harmless. And that's exactly what he wanted them to think. Because while he was teaching Sunday school and citing people for lawn violations, Dennis Rader was also driving around Wichita, stalking women, breaking into their homes, going through their things. He called these women his projects. He'd see someone at the grocery store, at a gas station, walking down the street, and he'd start building a fantasy around her. He'd follow her home, learn her routine, break into her house when she wasn't there and go through her belongings, steal underwear, take photographs, masturbate in her bedroom. And when the fantasy reached its peak, when he couldn't control the urge anymore, he'd strike. On March 17, 1977, 3 years after the Otero murders, Dennis Rader decided it was time to kill again. His target was Shirley Vian, 26 years old, a single mother of 3 young children, ages 5, 7, and 8. She lived in a small house on the north side of Wichita. Shirley was sick that day, the flu. She was in bed, trying to rest while her kids played in the living room. There was a knock at the door. Shirley answered it, and Dennis Rader was standing there with a briefcase. He told her he was a private detective working a case in the neighborhood, asked if he could come in and talk to her for a few minutes about a recent burglary. Shirley, sick and exhausted and not thinking clearly, let him inside. The moment the door closed, Rader pulled out a gun. He ordered Shirley's 3 children into the bathroom. The kids were terrified, crying, begging not to be separated from their mother. Rader locked them inside, told them to be quiet, and their mom would be fine. Then he went back to Shirley's bedroom. He tied her up, hands behind her back, ankles bound, and then he put a plastic bag over her head and strangled her to death while her children listened from the bathroom. When he was done, he left, just walked out the front door like nothing had happened. The kids stayed in the bathroom for hours, too terrified to come out. When they finally did, they found their mother's body on the bed. The Wichita Police Department immediately suspected BTK. The MO matched, the methodology was the same, but they had no physical evidence linking the crime to anyone specific. 9 months later, on December 8, 1977, Rader killed again. Nancy Fox was 25 years old. She worked as a secretary, lived alone in a small house in Wichita. That evening, Dennis Rader broke into her home and waited, hid in a closet, waited for hours until Nancy came home from work. When she walked through the door, Rader stepped out with a gun, told her the same lie he'd told the others, just needed money and a car and then he'd be gone. Nancy complied, handed over her purse, her keys, tried to stay calm, and then Rader tied her up and strangled her in her own bed. But this time he did something different. After he killed Nancy, he called the police from a payphone. "Yes, you will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing," he said. Then he hung up. The police rushed to the scene, found Nancy's body, processed the crime scene, and within hours, they received another communication from BTK. This time, a letter describing Nancy's murder in graphic detail. He was taunting them, playing games, proving that he could kill whenever he wanted, and they couldn't stop him. The city of Wichita was in full panic mode now. Women were terrified to be home alone. Gun sales skyrocketed. People installed deadbolts, security systems, motion lights. The police increased patrols, put out warnings, told women to lock their doors, be aware of strangers, don't let anyone inside they didn't know. But it didn't matter, because Dennis Rader didn't look dangerous. He looked like a security technician, a compliance officer, a church volunteer, someone you'd trust. And that's what made him so terrifying. After Nancy Fox's murder in 1977, BTK sent a few more communications over the next couple of years. Letters, poems, drawings, each one designed to keep himself in the headlines, to prove he was still out there, still in control. But then, in 1979, the letters stopped, and the killings stopped. For years there was nothing. No communications, no murders, no sign of BTK at all. The task force kept working, but resources dwindled. Detectives retired. New cases came in, and slowly the BTK investigation went cold. People started to believe that maybe he really was gone, dead, in prison somewhere for another crime, or moved to another city. But Dennis Rader was still there, still in Wichita, still living his double life. He had just learned to control the urges better, to satisfy them in other ways. He continued his projects, stalking women, breaking into homes, stealing underwear, masturbating in strangers' bedrooms. He kept detailed records of everything, drew pictures, wrote fantasies, created a whole elaborate internal world where he was the master and everyone else was his plaything. But he didn't kill, not for years, until 1985, when the urge became too strong to resist. On April 27, 1985, Dennis Rader killed Maureen Hedge, 53 years old. She lived just a few doors down from him in Park City. Rader broke into her home, waited for her to come back, and strangled her in her bedroom. But he didn't just kill her and leave. That wasn't enough anymore. He put Maureen's body in the trunk of his car and drove it to Christ Lutheran Church, the church where he was president of the council, where he taught Sunday school, where everyone knew him as Dennis the devoted Christian. He took her into the church building, laid her body out, and photographed her in bondage poses, different positions, different angles, creating trophies, documentation, proof of what he had done. When he was finished, he drove her body to a remote area and dumped it in a ditch. It took almost a week for someone to find her. The police suspected it might be BTK. The MO was similar, the methodology matched, but after 7 years of silence, they couldn't be sure. Maybe it was a copycat. Maybe it was someone else entirely. 6 months later, on September 16, 1986, Rader killed Vicki Wagerly. Vicki was 28 years old, married, a mother. She was home alone that afternoon when Dennis Rader knocked on her door. He pretended to be a telephone repairman, said there was a problem with the phone lines in the neighborhood, needed to check her phone. Vicki let him inside. The moment the door closed, Rader attacked. He strangled her with a nylon stocking, photographed her body, stole her driver's license as a trophy. Vicki's husband Bill came home 2 hours later and found her. The police investigated, but they didn't connect it to BTK. The case went unsolved, and once again, Dennis Rader walked away. 5 years later, Rader killed his final victim. Dolores Davis was 62 years old, a widow. She lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Wichita. On January 19, 1991, Dennis Rader broke into her home, strangled her, took her body out to a remote area under a bridge and dumped it. It would be 13 days before someone found her, and after that, Dennis Rader stopped killing entirely. Not because he felt guilty, not because he'd changed, but because the risk was getting too high. He had a family now, a reputation to maintain, a life he didn't want to lose. He had his projects, he had his photographs, he had his trophies, he had his memories, and for Dennis Rader, that was enough, for now. Here's the question everyone asks about BTK. Why did he stop? From 1991 to 2004, Dennis Rader didn't kill anyone. 13 years of silence, and the answer reveals everything about his intent. Dennis Rader didn't stop killing because he'd changed. He stopped because he had found other ways to feel power. Remember, for Rader, the murders were never really about killing. They were about total control, the ability to dominate another human being completely, to play God. By 1991, he had other sources for that feeling. His compliance officer job gave him legitimate authority. He could cite people, force them to obey, watch them scramble to comply with his orders. His church council presidency gave him respect and moral authority. His trophies and photographs let him relive the murders whenever he wanted. And his projects, stalking women, breaking into homes, stealing underwear, let him maintain the fantasy without the risk. For 13 years, that was enough. But the intent never changed. The desire to dominate, to control, to possess absolute power over another human being, that was still there. Every single day, he just found ways to feed it that didn't involve murder. Until 2004, when he realized the world was forgetting him. When he saw that newspaper article about the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders and understood that people had moved on without giving him credit. And that's when his ego, that massive, fragile, narcissistic ego, couldn't stay quiet anymore. Intent doesn't lie. People do. And BTK's intent had been the same since 1974, to prove he was God, to prove he had power, to prove nobody could stop him. The only thing that changed was how he chose to prove it. Who else is out there living a double life? Who else is playing the role of neighbor, coworker, friend, while hiding something monstrous underneath? We want to believe we'd know. We want to believe evil is recognizable. But BTK proved otherwise. And in 2004, he had proved something else. That ego is the one thing a psychopath can't control. That the need for recognition, for credit, for acknowledgement, that need can be stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. Next time on Deadly Intent, Part 2, the letters return. The game begins, and a floppy disk will finally bring down the killer who thought he was untouchable. Because in the end, it wasn't good detective work that caught BTK. It wasn't forensic science or witness testimony or a lucky break. It was his own arrogance, his own need to be remembered, his own inability to let the world forget what he had done. Intent doesn't lie. People do. And Dennis Rader's intent? To be recognized, to be acknowledged, to be remembered as something more than just another compliance officer in Park City. That intent would be his downfall.